Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Sabono Discovery Center. Learners, today we are dealing with topic 5. And topic 5, we are starting off first with the source-based question. And the source-based question that we're dealing with is TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's important that we understand that the TRC, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is a source-based question. Now, it's important that we understand that paper 1 has got 3 source-based questions, 3 essay questions. When we actually move over to paper 2 also has got basically 3 source-based questions and 3 essay questions. Now, the question that we're dealing with today, it is called Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this question actually is question 2 in paper 2. Take note, question 2 in paper 2, and it's called Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But before we start off, let us go over to how we should interpret historical information, meaning how should we answer source-based questions as such. We need to understand that there are 3 questions in paper 1, source-based, 3 questions in paper 2, source-based, and all 3 questions are divided into what we call cognitive levels. And the cognitive levels that you can see on the screen is level 1, level 2, level 3. Now let's go quickly first, briefly through level 1. We'll go also to level 2 and 3 at the same time. And afterwards, we will more go into detail pertaining to level 3 questions. Let's go to level 1. Level 1 is what we call extract evidence from sources, selection and organization of relevant information from the sources, define historical concepts or terms, and the percentage there is 30%, and the mark allocation will be 14 marks for level 1 question. Then level 2 is what we call interpretation of evidence from sources, explain information gathered from the sources, analyze evidence from the sources, and the percentage there is 40%, meaning the weighting is 40%. Then we move over to the mark allocation. The mark allocation for level 2 questions in all the source questions is 20. Level 3, interpret and evaluate evidence from sources, engage with sources to determine its usefulness, are reliable, bias, and limitations, compare and contrast interpretation and perspectives presented in sources, and draw independent conclusions. What is the percentage? The percentage is 30%, and the marks is 16. Now let's go over to level 1 questions. Level 1 questions require you to extract information from the sources and define historical concepts. These questions carry a maximum mark of 2 marks. So you can look on the screen, it says 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 1 is 2, 1 times 2 is 2 basically. Then with level 1 questions, we have what we call question verbs. The question verbs are list, quote, identify, and name. Typical level 1 questions that you will be confronted with, I'm sure you have been confronted with already when you did your SBA. What information in the source tells you about? Quote 2 reasons from the source. What do you understand by the term? So it's pertinent that we understand that these level 1 questions, it is basically, most of them are in the source. Now take note what I said, most of them are in the sources. Now, why do I say most of them? Because when it comes to the definitions, the definitions is what you should have studied and what you should know basically. Now, take note, there is what we call question verbs and typical question 1 questions. The typical question 1 questions, it is basically how they phrase it. The question verbs it is the key words within a particular sentence that informs us that this answer is in the source. Now let's move over to level 2 questions. Level 2 questions require you to interpret, to analyze, and engage with evidence from the sources. These questions carry a maximum mark of 4 marks basically. For example, 2 times 2 equals 4. Question verbs. Now look at the question verbs here, because if I think back on the question verbs pertaining to level 1 questions, I remember lists, quote, identify a name. But when we look at level 2 questions, we can clearly see on the screen it says explain, comment, describe, organize. Typical questions. What message does the cartoonist convey? Explain in your own words. Why do you think? So this is what we call typical questions. At the same time, it is question, and we have our question verbs. We need to know the mark your location pertaining to this also. Then let's go to level 3 questions. Level 3 questions require you to explain the different perspectives of sources. You must draw your own conclusions with regards to how reliable is the source, the usefulness of the source, and the limitations as such. These questions carry a maximum mark of 4 marks basically. Like we said earlier, with level 2 questions, it's also a maximum mark of 4. But this question, the maximum mark in level 3 questions, it is basically 8. Then we find question verbs. Compare, contrast, comment, justify. Then typical questions would be explain to what extent the evidence in source 1A, compare the evidence in source 1A and B, comment on the usefulness, how reliable, limitations of the information in source 1B. Now let's move over to the mark allocation. The mark allocation, the number in front informs us. The number in front informs us that the amount of responses that must be provided. So when we look at the amount of responses that must be provided, it means we can see that let's go to the first row of letters. The 1 is in front, it's circled in red, so that means you must provide one answer. And for one answer, you will receive 2 marks. When you go to the bottom row of numbers, the first 2 is circled. What does it mean? It means now you must provide 2 answers, and one of them will be 2 marks if you answer 2, and then you will receive 4 marks. Now, vice versa, basically. We need to understand that a number at the back of the mark allocation is the amount of marks that you will receive. The one in front is the amount of responses, the amount of answers that you must provide. Now let's go further into the mark allocation and what does it actually mean. If you see a mark allocation of 1 times 1, 2 times 1, 3 times 1, this is what we call extraction level 1 questions. It means you go straight to the source and you find the answer. We need to understand that, and we will be doing an example later in the session where you will begin to notice that the first answer is normally in the first 3 to 4 lines. Then the other one follows after that. Then the other one follows after that. So what am I trying to indicate to you? I'm trying to indicate to you that number 3's answer will not be in the first 3 to 4 rows. So that means now the answers follows after each other, and like it says on the screen, go back to the source and find the answer. It means you must read it. If you see a mark allocation of 1 times 2 equals 2, that means it could be, take note, a definition. Go and look in the source first, but when you go and look in the source, it means it is not, definitions are not in the sources. Definitions is what you need to go and study. So it's important that you understand that if you have not studied the work, it becomes difficult for you to write down all your definitions. If you see a mark allocation of 2 times 2, this is an interpretation or this question must be analyzed. You need to have learned your work in order to look at the source, understand what is being asked of you, and apply your knowledge and understanding in order to answer the question. Remember, look at the mark allocation of the question, and that will guide you as to whether the answer in the source or whether you will have to interpret it. For example, this is mostly what we call level 2 questions, according to the source and your own knowledge. So that means, according to the source, the first part will be in the source, and the second part, own knowledge, means you must have studied the work. This is what they are trying to say here. Then, but we'll deal with it later at the same time. Then we need to understand that there are typical, or let's call it types of question, level 3 questions basically. For example, how do sources support each other? Compare, contrast questions. How biased is a source? How reliable is the source? The usefulness of a source and the limitations as such also. Now let's go further into detail. When we talk about support, normally they say, how does source 1A support 1B with regards to the topic that you are dealing with? So that means once we see that type of question, and this is what we need to understand. This question is asking you how the two sources are similar. So it's important that we write down when they say support, it means how the sources are similar. When we talk about similar, it means how are they the same. What do they have in common? It means what does these sources have in common? It means what is the same in them. What do you do? How do you actually answer these type of questions? You go to source 1A, find something in that source that is supported, shows the same thing in source 1B. In your answer, you say source 1A says there are mountains. And this is supported by 1B, which says there are smaller mountains. So what is the same? What is similar? Mountains. 1A says there are mountains, and this is supported by 1B, which says there are mountains. Yes, although the one say they are smaller, but the other one say they're just mountains, basically. Then you must go back now, and you need to find another example of something that is common in both source A and source B. For example, you go back to 1A says there are lions, and this is supported by 1B, which says there are lions also. So now we can see the similarity. The lions are there. Or it could be source 1A says there are cats, and this is supported by 1B, which says there are lions. A lion is a cat, basically. So we need to understand that when they talk about similarities, it means that it must be the same. Now, what happens is if the words are exactly the same, all you can write is both sources indicates there are lions. Then you go back, both sources indicate there are mountains. So learners, we need to distinguish when we talk about similarities. Similarities could also be if they basically say there are cars, and the next source say there are big cars. So now we need to understand that cars are the similarities here. So in that cases, we need to say in 1A says there are cars, and this is supported by 1B, which says there are bigger cars. So now we cannot write it down now as both, because why? Bigger cars and cars, although cars are being mentioned. So when we need to write both, we need to say both sources indicate there were cars, basically. Now let's go to contrast. What is contrast? Contrast means what is contradicting, what is opposite to each other, and how are they opposing each other, basically. So what do? The same way we actually answered, like I said earlier, the same way that we answer support, compare, we answer the same way. So this is what you need to say. What do? You go to the first source and find something that is opposite or is in contradiction towards the second source. In your answer, you should say the following. Source 1A says there are dogs, and this is contradicted by source 1B, which says there are horses. So now we can clearly see now that the contradiction is dogs and horses, basically. Then you go back and find another two examples of something that is in contradiction with regards to the other source. So now you go back to the source and you write again. 1A says there are big countries, and this is contradicted by 1B, which says there are small countries. So what is the contradiction here? Big and small. So now we can clearly distinguish. When they say support, it means similarities. It means it is the same. So the same clearly understands what I understand by the same. It means it is the same. But take note, the meaning is the same, but sometimes the spelling is not the same. So when it comes to contradiction, it is quite evident that both is not the same. The spelling is not the same. Nothing is basically the same. There is a massive contradiction pertaining to that basically. Now let's go over to bias. What is bias? A bias source is one that has only one point of view. It is one person's country, opinion, thought, feeling on a particular matter. A bias source offers a limited view of something, so we need to look for the motive of those particular words. Then let's go over to limitations. These kind of questions point to the quality of a source. What do? It's point to the quality of a source. So you will be looking at things like, is the source biased? How reliable? And this will then point you in the direction of whether the source will be useful or not. Take note, we're talking about limitations here. We're talking about limitations. For example, the source may be limited because it only presents one side. So we spoke already about biasness. Or it may be limited because the source is not accurate and consistent with other sources. So what can we see when they talk about limitations? Limitations, we look at is if the source is biased, if there's no date, take note, if there's no date that indicate when the source was actually published. And we need to also look at the author. If there's no author, it means the source becomes biased basically. So those are the three things that we need to be aware of when answering limitation questions. We need to look, is the source biased? Is it from one side only? We need to also look if there's a date when the source was published. We need to look who published the source. It means the author, the person that's responsible for this particular source. Now let's go over to how reliable is sources basically. Two questions that you need to ask yourself. Is the source accurate? Can the source be trusted? So when we go further down the slide, if your answer is yes, the source is accurate, the source can be trusted, then this is what you need to ask yourself further now. Who wrote the source? When was the source made? It means, when was it published? Why was it created? Is the evidence in the source consistent with evidence from other sources? It means, can it be corroborated with? Now, when we look at how reliable is the source, what we need to understand, we need to look at who wrote it. It means the author. We need to look at the person that published it. We need to look at when was the source created. What does it mean? It means we need to look at the date. So what am I saying here? When you answer the source, we need to say the source is reliable because it's informing us who the author of the source is. The author of the source is John Wayne. Then when we go to the next one, the source is reliable because the source informs us. Take note, the source informs us that it was published in 1974. Who created the source? The source is an extract from a government document annotated by John Wayne. So I'm just using an example here now. Then let's go to usefulness. So when we answer usefulness are basically presented in two ways. The first part is comment on the usefulness. The second one is explain the usefulness. When they talk about explain the usefulness, we need to remember the following that we are going to talk about when they talk about explain the usefulness. When they talk about comment on the usefulness, it means it's informing. It says comment on the usefulness. What are they saying? The source is already useful. So what do? We go into the source and we summarize two main ideas from the source, what the source is informing us about. But when we answer explain the usefulness, let's go through the side and then we will understand when it talks about explain the usefulness. The usefulness of the source depends on the purpose of the source. That's the first thing that we need to understand. What is the source being used for? Is it relevant to my investigation? How reliable is the source? Is it accurate? Does it mean what it says? Can it be corroborated with? Who produced it and why? So learners, when the question is posed, explain the usefulness, it reminds us about how reliable is the source. So now we can clearly see when they say explain the usefulness, it means we answer it almost in the same fashion that we would answer how reliable is this particular source. So now we need to focus on the message of the source. Assess whether the information in the source can be used for the period or event under discussion. So now we can clearly see, learners, when it talks about reliable, we need to zoom in to explain the usefulness. You answered basically on the same pattern basically. Then let's move over to the paragraph. It is important, learners, that we understand that the paragraph is also a level 3 question. And level 3 questions basically indicates 2 times 2. But when it comes to the paragraph is basically 8 marks. Take note, there is no 1 times 8 basically. No. 1 times 8 means you must provide one answer and you will get 8 marks. It is not 8 times 1. It means now 8 times, if the 8 is in front, it means you must give 8 responses. No, the paragraph is basically marked or assessed holistically, analytically through a rubric basically, and it is 8 marks. The question is phrased in such a way that it will be a level 3 question. For example, it will start like this: explain the role, the impact, cause, effects of significance of a particular historical event. Then it will continue. Then it will say you must use the relevant sources in your own knowledge and write a paragraph. Now take note, when they say write a paragraph, they normally say write a paragraph of 8 lines and 80 words basically, or 80 words basically. Now, what we need to understand is that when they talk about the 80 words, when they talk about the 8 lines, yes, 8 lines is basically the minimum. 80 words is the minimum. It means now, if you go beyond 80 words, you will not be punished. Remember now, this is history. In English, I know that learners are being punished when they go over or when they under, basically. So with history, if you go 80 words is the minimum. 8 lines is the minimum. So it means when you go over, you will not be punished. But take note, your paragraph answer is not supposed to be a quarter of the page. Yes, it can be half of the page, sometimes just a little bit less than half of the page. But we need to understand now, when we answer the paragraph question, it's pertinent that we understand that the key question within the source, that is basically your paragraph question. So what am I saying here now? When you start with a question, this is now question 2 that we're dealing with. When you look at the question, it will indicate to us on top, it will be in bold, and that will be our key question. So when we look at the key question, it will be in bold. So that key question is basically our paragraph question. So why am I saying this now? As you can see on the screen, it says you must read through all the sources and underline the relevant facts in each source that answers the question we have been asked. Now take note, learners. There are 4 sources within question 1, 2, and 3. All 3 questions have got 4 sources. So when we answer question 2, which is the question that we are dealing with currently, there will be always 1 visual source and there will be 3 written source. So the visual source normally speaks to the written source. So it means now 3 of the sources is basically what we need to underline. So when we start with source 1A, we need to read the key question first. So we read the key question, we go to source 1A, and we're about to answer those questions in 1A. What should you do now? You should have the key question in mind. And after having the key question in mind, what should you do? You underline what's answering the key question, basically. Then you go to source 1B now. So when you go to 1B, take note, you are done with 1A. Now you go to 1B. You underline what's answering the key question, basically. You are still answering the questions within 1B. And when we go to 1C, 1C could maybe be a visual source. So that source now speaks maybe to 1D. So when we get to 1D, we underline. So it means now, learners, there is no such thing as there's two answers because it must be 8 sentences. No. In source 1A, you can maybe find 3 and 4 answers, or you can maybe just find 2. Sometimes we can only find maybe 5 or 6 facts basically, then the others are own knowledge. Take note, own knowledge, it's important that we also add it to it also. Then what we need to remember, learners, is that the content must relate to the question when you answer it. Take note, the content from your textbook and the content you were taught. This is what we talk about when we talk about own knowledge. It's content from the textbook and what you have been taught. This will become now your own knowledge. Now, learners, it is important that we understand how do we write our answer down. Now, here's an example. Remember to reference your sources. You do not have to say, in source 1A, Kennedy said. You don't have to say, but you can do it if it's fine like that. But this is how it should be done. All you need to do is write down the relevant information, and then after your point has been made, after you've written down your point, in brackets you write 1A. Now, say for instance, now there are 3 facts answering the question. Yes, after the first one, you indicate source 1A. Now you write again what is in 1A. Then you indicate again 1A. Now take note, learners, this is a paragraph. So when we talk about paragraph, it means it's flowing in each other. So we need to understand that. Like I've earlier indicated to you, it mustn't be more than 3/4 of a page, or it mustn't be the entire page. It must be less. It must be half or less than the half. Now, before we move over to the content, it's important that we understand that there are certain skills and certain techniques how we should answer level 1, level 2, level 3 questions. And I actually went through it right now. So you can just rewind this recording, and at the same time you can just go through it thoroughly, and that will give you an idea how you should answer your source-based questions. Now let's quickly go over to the overview so that we can understand what is the content pertaining to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But before we do that, let's quickly go to the structure, question 1, question 2, question 3, so that we can have a clear understanding. When we look at question 1 informs us that 1.1.1 up until 1.5.3, those are level 1 questions. So as we can see, 1.1.1, 1.1.2, that is now found in source 1A. 1.2.1, 1.2.2, 1.2.2b, that is found in source B. 1.5, 1.5.3, that is now found basically in the last source. Then we can clearly see the mark allocation. The mark allocation is 1 times 2, 2 times 1. And when we look at the questions being posed, the first question, the 1.1.1, explain the concept, give 2 reasons, identify 2, according to the source, according to the source, according to the source, 2 methods. So now we can clearly see all these answers. No, not all of them, but the definition is not in the source. Explain the concept is not in the source. That you must have studied. But the rest of the other questions, the answers are in the source. So when we move now to level 2 questions, level 2 starts 1.1.3 up until 1.5.2. When we look at the mark scheme, which is the mark allocation, we can see, yes, 1.3.1, it is 1 times 2. When we look at the questions being posed, it says use the information in the source and own knowledge, comment, explain how using the information in the source in your own. Now, this is important. Use the information in the source and your own knowledge. When we look at the mark scheme, 2 times 2. So let's move over to level 3 questions. When we go over to level 3 questions, we can see there are 3 questions, 1.4 and 1.2.4, 1.6. So when we look at 1.2.4, that is basically source B, source 1B. So now we can clearly see how the questions, how the different cognitive levels are spread across the question paper basically. When we go to 1.4, it's a comparison. When we go to 1.2.4, it's a usefulness. So it can be comment or it can be explain the usefulness. 1.6, it's a paragraph question. So when we add up 14, 20, 16, it gives us 50 marks. Now we move over to question 2. When we go to question 2, from 2.1.1 up until 2.3.1, that is what we call level 1 questions. When we go to the questions being posed, quote 2, define concept, why according to the information in the source, what, name any four, why according to the information in the source. Now, learners, when we look at the level 1 questions, it is 4, but take note, concepts are not in the sources. You must have studied the concepts. It's never in the sources. Then we go to level 2 questions. It starts by 2.1.3 and it ends by 2.5.2. So when it stops basically there, by 2.5.2, now we can clearly see when we look at the mark, now at the questions being posed, comment, explain why you think, explain the messages, comment. So when we look at all those questions being posed and you look at the mark allocation, we see level 1, 14, level 2, 20. When we go to level 3, we basically see level 3 is supposed to be 16 marks, but when we look at the questions, usefulness, compare paragraph, so that's a clear indication that the question paper will be basically 50 marks. When we go to question 3, we can see it's divided again into level 1, level 2, and level 3. And that informs us basically that the mark allocation that will be given, basically, it depends on the cognitive level of a particular question. Now let's quickly go into the overview. The overview is basically the guideline, what we should know pertaining to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, background and introduction to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This section deals with how South Africans take note, South Africans try to deal with the painful past in order to heal through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, basically. Now, it's important that we understand that before we start basically with this topic, we need to know the concepts. Because if we don't know the concepts, it becomes difficult, because remember what I said, the concepts must be studied. The first concept that you can see on the screen is called amnesty. So amnesty means being officially forgiven. So what some learners do is they write, you are forgiven. So we cannot accredit that as an accurate answer. Amnesty means official pardon. So if the learner wrote official pardon, pardon is basically like, okay, you are forgiven, basically. Atrocities, shocking and cruel acts against any enemy during conflict. Compensation, number 3, amount paid for loss or damage. 4, human rights violation, abuse of individual rights, perpetrators, people who commit crimes or abuse. Number 6, third force, an anonymous group that stirs conflict between two oppositions, basically. Witch hunt, an intense, systematic campaign directed against those who have done something wrong. 8, restorative justice, based on reconciliation, where perpetrators get amnesty. 9, retributive justice, based on revenge, where perpetrators are punished, actually. Reconciliation, making peace between perpetrators and the human rights violation and victims of these political crimes, basically. So now we can clearly see these are the definitions that will not be in the sources. You need to study these definitions. It's pertinent that you study them properly. Now let's quickly go through the overview, what you should know, and then after the overview we will go for a break. Question 2. This was a court-like body assembled in SA after the end of apartheid under the leadership of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Anybody who felt that he had been the victim of violence could come forward and be heard at a TRC. Now take note, a victim of political violence. The perpetrators of violence could also give public testimony and request amnesty from prosecution. The TRC was a crucial component of the transition to full and transparency, free democracy in South Africa. It was a public forum and procedures were broadcasted on TV. It is, despite its flaws, generally seen as a success, basically. So this is what the TRC basically entails. It talks about, it says it was in the form of a court. And the most important thing is when we go to the last one, it was a public forum and procedures were broadcast live on television. So what transpired here is that if the event occurred, for instance, in Mitchells Plain, Cape Town, what would happen? They would go to Mitchells Plain in the community hall, and there would be a setup like a court-like a structure, and then the proceedings would actually continue basically. But what we need to understand, there was always two parties. It was the victim and the perpetrator. So we need to understand that sometimes the victim was not available because the victim was killed during that process, but the perpetrators were always there during that process, basically. And what we need to understand is there was a request for amnesty. So when we come back from our break, we will be dealing with, in particular, with more content pertaining to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
I want you to ask yourself these 3 questions. Number 1, what do I want? Do I want to become an A student, or do I want to become an average student? Number 2, I want you to ask yourself, how do you plan on getting there? Are you going to put more extra hours, or are you going to just sleep? Number 3, who will be with you in this journey? Because it is important that we associate ourselves with students who have the same vision as us, who want to become A students, who want to put in the extra work, who want to become better at what they do. Unsuccessful people do not plan, they just let life happen to them. But successful people are planning on how they want their lives to be. And right now, you plan on how you want your results at the end of the year to be like.
Welcome back, grade 12 learners. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Sabono Discovery Center. The first session we dealt with historical skills, how we should answer source-based questions. Now we're moving into the content. After the content, I have two sources that we are going to work through, and there are some questions that we will answer together basically. Now let me just re-emphasize. I ended off with the questions and I ended off basically with an overview of the TRC basically. Let's go again through the concepts. Number one, I said amnesty, being officially forgiven. I remember now the word forgiven can be replaced by pardon, being officially pardoned at the same time. Number two, atrocities, shocking and cruel actions against any enemy during conflict. Compassion, compensation, amount paid for loss or damage, human rights violation, abuse of individual rights, perpetrators, people who commit crimes or abuse, third force, an anonymous group that stirs conflict between two opposition parties, witch hunt, an intense systematic campaign directed against those who have done something wrong. Restorative justice based on reconciliation where perpetrators get amnesty. Retributive justice based on revenge where perpetrators are punished basically. Reconciliation, making peace between perpetrators of HRV means human rights violation, and victims of these crimes must be politically motivated. That is now what we call reconciliation. Then let's go again through it. Amnesty, being officially forgiven or pardoned. Atrocities, shocking and cruel acts against an enemy during conflict. Compensation, amount paid for loss or damage. Human rights violation, abuse of individual rights, perpetrators, people who commit crimes or abuses, third force, an anonymous group that stirs conflict between two opposing parties, witch hunt, an intense systematic campaign directed against those who have done something wrong. Restorative justice based on a reconciliation where perpetrators get amnesty. Then retributive justice based on revenge where perpetrators are punished. Reconciliation means making peace between perpetrators of human rights violation and victims of these political crimes. Now let's go over to the overview. What is a TRC all about? This was a court-like body assembled in South Africa after the end of apartheid under the leadership of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Anybody who felt that he had been the victim of violence, this violence must be politically connected, could come forward and be heard at the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The perpetrators of violence could also give public testimony and request amnesty from prosecution. So when we talk about request amnesty, now we have seen in the definition, amnesty is what? Official pardon, official forgiveness, basically. Prosecution means, and we'll talk about it later, prosecution means in a court of law, basically. The TRC was a crucial component of the transition to full and free democracy in South Africa. It was a public forum and procedures were broadcasted on TV, despite its flaws generally seen as successful. Like we explained before the break, if the event happened in Soweto, they would go to, if it happened in Soweto, say in Zola, they would go to Zola, utilize the community hall there, and the community hall would be set up like in a court setup. So Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the chairperson, Alex Bowring the vice chairperson. They would be divided up into different sections, and the court case would continue, and the public, they were allowed basically to sit in. At the same time, the media was also allowed to sit in during this process. So it was not in the official court, but in the community where the incident basically occurred. Now let's move quickly to, now we need to understand that the TRC had three committees. Firstly, they had to see if human rights violation was committed. If yes, then you went to the amnesty committee. If amnesty was granted by the amnesty committee, then take note, the victims and perpetrators had to go to the rehabilitation committee now. So those three committees, it is what entailed basically the TRC. Take note, Human Rights Violation Committee, to see if this crime is really politically motivated, amnesty committee, and a rehabilitation committee basically. Now, what should we understand here? There were debates around the TRC, if it was successful or not. So let's quickly look at the debates. The first point, debates around the TRC and the negotiating process was between the government and the ANC. Take note, between the National Party and the ANC. There had to be a reconciliation process with regards to it. Why? Because of the context of violence, and it had a threat on the negotiating process as such also. And the TRC had to be successful. Why? Because of the threat on the negotiating process. So we need to understand that they were saying, listen here, we are coming from a system of apartheid. People lost their lives. People are filled with unforgiveness, with hatred. So what should they do now? So now they were discussing how is the truth and reconciliation, will it be successful? But take note, the ANC came to the forefront and they say, listen here, we will set up a committee, and this committee will entail Archbishop Desmond Tutu as the chairperson, Alex Bowring as the deputy. Now take note, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was a African. Dr. Alex Bowring was a European as such. So when I say African, it means a black individual. When I say European, it means a white individual. So now they had two people, different colors, but they were on one side. They were the Committee of the Truth and Reconciliation. And like I said, there were certain debates around it. Will it be successful or not? Because of the violence that occurred during the apartheid years, basically. And we need to understand is that there was also discussions, basically, what type of justice system must be implemented. So we need to understand that and it was between restorative justice and retributive justice. So we need to understand, what is restorative justice. Restorative justice means that there must be healing that takes place, and it must address the injustice of the past. That is what we call restorative. Restorative means you restore the perpetrator back to the victim. It means there must be forgiveness, but there must be remorse in the forgiveness. Then retributive justice means punishment. It means punishment for what? For the criminal behavior. In the case of the Nuremberg trials. Now, what is the Nuremberg trials? This is grade 11 history. Nuremberg trials means after World War II, all the Nazi leadership, basically everyone that was part of the leadership of the Nazis, they were arrested, and the Nuremberg trials occurred in a town called Nuremberg. And there, all the leaders of the Nazis, they received what we call retributive justice. So in South Africa, they concluded and said, listen here, we are not going to go the route of retributive justice, but we're going the route of restorative. Now, what is the restorative? It means healing must take place, and they must address the injustice of the past, basically. And this is why it was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, basically. Now, what was the main reason for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? We see there's a visual source, and basically we see that now the Dalai Lama, he is the person there, and he's talking and he's saying, if we don't find out what's in there, it will keep on haunting us as a country, basically. So now we can clearly see. He says, if we don't find out what's in the house, he's talking about the house, it will keep on haunting us forever. Now, we can clearly see that he's got the light. And this this light that is basically carrying, this light is, it's written on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it means now the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it's basically what will bring light to the past with regards to the atrocities that was committed in South Africa. And that was the main reason why, to unravel the past, to bring back together perpetrators and victims so that we cannot find ourselves in a civil war in South Africa. Now, what were the debates around the TRC? There were positive and there were negative. Let us first look at the positive aspects of the TRC. The TRC's rational assume South Africa to be deeply divided and in need of healing, not through a forgetting of the history of our division, but through formal engagements with that history within South Africa. The TRC was then a key instrument in South Africa to find a post-apartheid reconciliation process. The significance of the TRC is related not only to memory of the past, but also to the contribution to memory of South Africa's transition to democracy. Future historians of the transition will find the story of the TRC looming largely, basically. The records of the TRC are important as a memory resource, as the records of the past, which has been reclaimed and generated, basically. Now, that is what we call basically the positive aspects. Basically, it means, yes, there will be records and it will be reflected. Why was certain things done, basically? Now, what was the mandate of the TRC? After the mandate, we will go look into the negative part also. Now, what was the mandate of the TRC? The first part is they must bear witness. Meaning, what is bear witness? They must listen and know what transpired, basically. Second point, they must record. They must put it on record. Third one, in some cases, they can grant amnesty to those who committed human rights abuses under apartheid, as long as the crimes were politically motivated. Now, proportionate, and there was a full disclosure. So what happened is, you only received amnesty. First thing, the crime, human rights abuse had to take place. Take note, amnesty was only granted if human rights abuse was evident, and the crime must be politically motivated. And lastly, there must be full disclosure. So now the question would be posed to you in the exam or the SBA, that you must explain, what does amnesty mean? So we're talking about the concept here now. You must explain what is amnesty. And amnesty has got three parts. When they grant amnesty, human rights must be violated. The crime must be politically motivated, and full disclosure must be given during the cross-examination process. The TRC listened to all sides, to the perpetrators and the victims, the apartheid state, and the liberators, which was called the ANC or the PAC at that point in time. It was not a court of justice because it was restorative. It was not a revenge strategy. It was not retributive justice. Take note, it was restorative, basically. Then, what are some of the TRC results? So we need to understand about 21,000 people applied for amnesty. Take note, most of the perpetrators, take note, most of the perpetrators, it basically came from the National Party side. Yes. The other part was basically from the liberators side at the same time also. But a lot of the liberators were in prison also because of crimes that was committed, and it was not connected to any politics, basically. So what am I saying here? So 21,000 people applied to the TRC to be heard. And take note now. So the 21,000 people that applied, they read the testimonies, they read the reports with regards to what occurred, basically. And from the 21,000, only 7,160 cases were heard. So what am I saying here? Yes, the rest from the 21,000, basically we can see that basically 14,000 were discarded basically. It means no, this crime was not politically motivated. Uh, human rights didn't take place. Now take note, in order to be heard, the crime, human rights must have been violated. It must be politically motivated. Those are the bases that they actually allowed cases to be heard. So 7,116 cases were heard. Then 5,392 they were refused amnesty. So that means now 75.8% of the applicants, they were refused amnesty. So that 392 that was refused amnesty, they would now go to the civil court. So when we talk about civil court, they would now stand in line to be prosecuted by the criminal court, basically. Now, from the 7,849 were granted amnesty. It means those 849 people, they didn't stand in line to be prosecuted. It means they were set free. And when you receive official pardon, which is called amnesty, it means now that case cannot be regenerated again. That case cannot stand up against you again. It has been nullified, basically. So we need to understand now both apartheid perpetrators and the ANC were condemned for committing atrocities, like I indicated to you. Mostly it was from the National Party and also from the ANC and PAC also. Research showed that the population of South Africa felt that the TRC failed to achieve reconciliation between black and white people in South Africa. People felt that the TRC was a prerequisite for reconciliation rather than an alternative. Now take note, prerequisition clearly means now that this was pre-planned, basically. This was in line, this was set up, that they will introduce the TRC and they will use the TRC to cover most of the things. Then, lastly, people also felt that the TRC was waiting in favor of the perpetrators of abuse, not the victims. So it means now what they were saying here is that the perpetrators were seen already as the guilty party even before the trial occurred. And what happened is that some of the major people refused to attend the TRC, basically. And this brings us now to the negative aspects of the TRC. Because why? People felt that although it gave many the opportunity to get to grip with the past mistakes, past violence, past aggression, the commission did not do enough to bridge the gap between white and black people as such. Why? There was still division. Black people were still poor. Black people were still uneducated. The uneducated black people were still in the majority, basically. And black people were still living in townships, while the white people were still living in affluent areas, basically. Like, for example, the family of Steve Biko opposed the amnesty process on the grounds that it would rob them of justice. Steve Biko's family felt, listen, your justice was not served because why? Yes, they disclose what transpired, but none of them wanted to take the blame, basically. So when I say none of them, it means now with Steve Biko's case, the people that was the perpetrators, which was the South African Defence Force members, none of them refused to take the blame. It means now it was not clear unto them, and for that reason, yes, they received amnesty. But Steve Biko's family felt that this case must go to the civil court. It must become a criminal case now because a murder has been committed and no one is coming to the forefront who actually did the deed. Like, for example, some of the apartheid leaders felt that this was a witch hunt. Remember now, witch hunt is one of the words that's a concept, basically. Now, what is a witch hunt? Witch hunt means that they were pinpointing this blame on certain individuals. And what happened is, like you can see on the screen, former State President Botha refused to testify, recalling the commission not to be equated with crimes done by illegitimate regime, basically. So it means now that PW Botha refused to come to the TRC. And when we go to our next point, many victims felt that the perpetrators got away with murder, like in the case of Steve Biko's family, and the apartheid agents felt that they were prosecuted for acting on orders of those above them, and these were not called to account for these deeds. So what happened is the ministers, some of the ministers refused to come to the TRC because they felt it was a witch hunt. Andries Triernig was one of the people that appeared, and he committed to certain crimes that he committed basically. But what transpired is that the National Party felt this was a witch hunt upon them, so that they need to pay for certain crimes. The ANC felt that the deeds that was committed, it was against the struggle for liberation, and it could not be acquitted with crimes done by a illegitimate regime, basically. And this also brings us to the point where it says now this whole thing was being restricted to politically motivated acts. So it means everything, all the crimes must be politically motivated. So it means that the racially motivated crimes were neglected. If a black person killed a white person, that crime was neglected basically. But some black people, some white people felt, listen here, those crimes had nothing to do with politics basically. Then Archbishop Desmond Tutu summed it all up in a Hyde book with the title "No Future Without Forgiveness." So we need to understand now, after everything occurred, this is what happened now. He had a book, and in the book was the name of the book was "No Future Without Forgiveness." Then let's look into further negativity. Basically, further negativity is basically that all people were not given a true reflection what transpired. Some people felt that, listen here, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was just another hoax. They firmly believe that, listen here, the Truth and Reconciliation didn't deal properly with certain matters, basically, because by some family members were never discovered. Truth was not revealed, even if they were still alive, if they were buried, or what happened to them, basically. For instance, on the Vlakplaas was a farm where the secret forces used to take the freedom fighters within South Africa, and some of them were buried there on the farm. Some of them were actually tortured severely, and truth was not revealed what actually transpired on that particular farm. For instance, Eugene the Cock, he was like the leader on that farm. Truth didn't came forth. Even like Basson. Basson was the one that was instigated, as he was one of the scientists that actually combined certain chemicals to actually torture the liberators within South Africa. But they could not get to grips what actually happened there. So the people felt that the TRC was not a success because only 849 people receive amnesty. So that in itself informs us that from 7,000 people, 849 people receive amnesty. So that actually left a bitter taste within the people in South Africa. It also further entailed that its works of reparation and rehabilitation has been found inadequate. Why? Because what transpired is, if you were the victim, you were promised a certain amount of money. Now take note, money could not replace the life of a lost victim, basically. So what transpired is, you presented your case before the Human Rights Violation Committee. They've heard it. Now it goes to the next committee, which is the amnesty. So amnesty would say granted or not granted. If it's granted, now you move over to the reparation and rehabilitation committee. And the reparation means that victims receive payment and counseling at the same time. Rehabilitation means the perpetrator had to go through a counseling process. Why? To rehabilitate that individual that committed that particular crime. Then its contribution to reconciliation has been questioned as such. These are important debates, important at many levels, not least in terms of the potential contribution to processes of reconciliation. What were the amnesty provisions basically? Perpetrators were to apply for amnesty in relation to each of their offenses, provide a full disclosure, and prove that their actions were politically motivated. So I'm just re-emphasizing what I earlier said. Many applicants for amnesty had already been convicted through the courts and were in jail when they applied for amnesty. Like I said, 21,000 people applied, but they were already in jail. Many others were, however, still free, having not yet been convicted, basically. Perpetrators who did not apply for amnesty face possible prosecution. Like I said, if you didn't receive amnesty, you would actually receive. Now, this is for the people that were not in jail. So if, for instance, now, in the case of Steve Biko, if they said amnesty is not granted, what would have happened is that those SAP, those SAPS officials would have now, that case would have been now transferred to a civil court. Civil court is where criminal cases are actually being heard. The only serious insensitive to now to the participation in the amnesty process for those who had not been convicted was the threat of prosecution, basically. And for that reason, the ministers and the key role players of the National Party refused to attend the TRC. The amnesty process was one that was generally accepted by survivors and society more broadly, basically. Now, what was the work of the Human Rights Commission? The Human Rights Commission looked now, because that was the first component, the first party. The human rights, they actually went through the first thing, the killing, abduction, torture of severe ill treatment of any person. Number two, an attempt, conspiracy, incitement, instigation, command, or procurement to commit an act of violence. Now, what is Desmond Tutu saying here in the caption? Hello, Truth Commission, I'm about to commit a politically motivated gross human rights violation, and I'd like to be included in your next extension of the amnesty cutoff date. Amnesty cutoff date extended yet again. So it means now the cutoff date was extended not once but numerous times as such. So what we can understand here is that the Truth and Reconciliation was to heal the wounds of the past, but the crimes must be between 1960 and 1994. Now, why not before 1960? Because apartheid started 1948. It's because from 1960, after the Sharpeville massacre, serious crimes were committed basically from both sides. And for that reason, they felt that, listen here, let's start by 1960 to 1994, basically. And what was the final report on the TRC? The report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission consists of 5 volumes, each with a particular focus. Number 1, the first volume, it provides the basis and rationale for the work of the Commission. Volume 2 addresses the Commission of gross human rights of violation of human rights of all sides of conflict. Volume 3 addresses gross violation of human rights from the perspective of the victim. That a victim is a companion to volume 2 as such also. So volume 3 is a companion of volume 2 also. Volume 4 seeks to address the nature of the society in which gross violation of human rights took place. Volume 5, the final volume of the report, contains the conclusions reached by the Commission, including analysis and findings and recommendations. Recommendations, the way forward: remembering the past, memorials, appropriate museums and memorials at local and national sites, use examples that learners can relate to. For example, Freedom Park. When we talk about Freedom Park, basically, when we go to Soweto, we find there's basically a museum or a memorial site of the incident with regards to Hector Peterson, basically. Then we can see the 5 volumes that was presented to our former President Nelson Mandela and it was presented by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So learners, so we need to understand, this is the content. We need to understand there were three committees: Human Rights Violation Committee, Amnesty Committee, and Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee. So once we understand that, then that's our basis. So we need to understand, why was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission established? It was to heal the wounds of the past through the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We also need to understand there was different debates. Will it work? Will it not work? We need to look at the positive side. The positive aspects was basically that the perpetrators and victims must reconcile. If they don't reconcile, it means it will leave a bitter taste in the black and white people in South Africa. But the negative aspects is some people felt that it was a witch hunt on them, particularly. It became personal unto them. Then a lot of families were not happy. They felt that the Truth and Reconciliation was not a success, because from the 7,160 applicants that was heard, only 849 received amnesty. So in that case, they felt that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not a success. And let's quickly move over. With that in mind, let's move over to questions that was set up quickly. Let's read through the source. It is two sources that we'll be dealing with. Let's read through the first source. The extract below focuses on the reasons for the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1995. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a court-like body assembled in South Africa after the end of apartheid. Anybody who felt that they had been a victim of violence could come forward and be heard at the TRC. Perpetrators of violence could also give testimony and request amnesty from prosecution. The hearings made international news, and many sessions were broadcast on national television. The TRC was a crucial component of the transition to full and free democracy in South Africa, and despite some flaws, it generally regarded as very successful. The mandate of the commission was to bear witness, to record, and in some cases grant amnesty to the perpetrators of crimes relating to human rights violations, reparations, and rehabilitation. The work of the TRC was accomplished through three committees: the Human Rights Violation Committee, investigating human rights abuses that took place between 1960 and 1994; the Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee, it was charged with restoring victims' dignity and formulating proposals to assist with rehabilitation; and the Amnesty Committee considered applications for amnesty that were requested in accordance with the provisions of the Act. In theory, the Commission was empowered to grant amnesty to those charged with atrocities during apartheid as long as two conditions were met: the crimes were politically motivated and the whole truth was told by the person seeking amnesty. No one was exempt from being charged, basically. Now let's go to the questions. Now remember what I said. I said that when you start the source, there is wording in bold, and that is what we call the key question. So it means, how did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission deal with the murder of the political activist Griffiths Mzingi? 2.1.1, who according to the source could come forward and be heard at the TRC? Now, remember what I said. The first questions are always in the first three lines. So the answer is, we can see basically there's two answers given here, but one, look at the market location, 1 times 1. Anybody who felt they had been a victim of violence, perpetrators of violence could also give testimony and request testimony from prosecution. So they only need one answer, and we have provided two answers, so you can write either or. Let's go define the concept amnesty in your own words. Look at the mark allocation, 1 times 2. All concepts, 1 times 2 mark allocation. Let's look at it. Official pardon. Remember we said in the definitions it was basically official forgiveness, and I said we can replace the word forgiveness with pardon. Official pardon for political crimes committed during apartheid in exchange for the disclosure of the whole truth and political motives, exempt from prosecution for perpetrators who would give testimony on human rights violation that would be proven to have been politically motivated. Question 213. Why do you think the hearings at the TRC made international news? Now take note, this is the question that they will always ask. Why do you think this article was published, basically? And here it says, why do you think the hearings at the TRC made international news? It was newsworthy. So always when they ask about newspaper or media, it was newsworthy and an international interest. The international communities wanted to see how South Africa wanted to address the atrocities of the past. Would it be restorative or retributive? The international communities wanted to see whether the restorative justice system that the TRC employed would work, or would the restorative would have been better. The international communities were concerned about how this process would unfold in South Africa. The international communities wanted to see how South Africa dealt with perpetrators who committed gross human rights violation. Now let's go to the next set of questions. 2.1.4, list any 3 mandates of the TRC as stated in the source. The answer that's provided: to bear witness, to record, and grant amnesty. Now take note, list. Remember, list, quote, identify, name. Grant amnesty to perpetrators of crimes relating to human rights violation, reparation, and rehabilitation. Now those answers are found where? In the source. 215, using the information in the source in your own knowledge, explain why you think the Human Rights Violation Committee investigated human rights abuses that took place. Now we can clearly see 2.1.5, it's a level 2 question. Look at the answer it's been given. 1996 was a turning point in South Africa's history, in that after, now take note, the question says using the information in the source and your own knowledge. This answer is not in the source. So this is what we call own knowledge. 1960 was a turning point in South Africa's history, in that after the Sharpeville massacre, the National Party adopted brutal methods against activists of the liberation movements. Second answer, from 1960, the liberation struggle started to operate underground with the apartheid government, resorting to human rights abuses to suppress the struggle. 1994 was also a turning point, significant of the end of apartheid and the dawn of a new democratic South Africa. Next answer, the highest number of deaths due to political violence occurred during this period. The TRC had limited resources and was mandated to deal with crimes committed between 1960 and 1994. So basically, all these answers here is what we call, it is answers that is own knowledge, basically. So none of them actually were retrieved from the sources, basically, besides the highest number of deaths due to political violence occurred during this period. So we need to understand when it says source and own knowledge. Then let's go to 2.1.6, state 2 conditions according to the source that perpetrators of human rights abuses had to meet before they could be granted amnesty. Look at the mark allocation, 2 times 1. It means provide 2 answers, 1 each. The crimes were politically motivated. The whole truth was told by the person seeking amnesty, basically. Now, this is just an example how the questions will be set up. Now, let's go to the next one. Source 2B. The poster below was produced by the TRC. It invites both perpetrators and victims to appear before the TRC and testify about human rights abuses that were committed between 1960 and 1994. Now, that's a caption being highlighted because the caption here is a bit too small. Now, let's go into the source. If your mother was tortured, your father murdered, and children abducted, would you be silent? Let's speak out to each other by telling the truth, by telling our stories of the past, so that we can walk the road to reconciliation together. Now let's go to the questions. First question, 2.2.1. Why did the TRC decide to produce this poster? Let's look at the answers. To encourage, appeal, to invite people, victims, perpetrators, to come forward and tell their stories. Now take note, we only need one answer, and we have provided basically 5 answers, say six answers basically, and we only need one answer. So the key here is to encourage, appeal, to invite people, victims, perpetrators, to come forward and tell their stories of human rights abuses, to establish a record of human rights atrocities committed during the apartheid regime, to provide an opportunity for victims to come forward to voice out the nature and extent of harm they had suffered so that they could be compensated and the dignity restored, basically. Now let's go to the next question, 2.2.2. Comment on how you think the TRC used the words, if your mother was tortured, father murdered, would you be silent on the poster in the context of the TRC hearings? Now, learners, this becomes difficult if you don't read English, if you have not studied the content as such also. Now, let's look at the answers provided. To encourage victims not to remain silent from any human rights abuse committed to his or her family member. Now, take note, we need to have two answers. Murder, abduction, and torture were regarded as human rights abuses that the TRC wanted to expose. Victims of human rights abuses like murder and torture should not be silenced and suffer in silence. To encourage victims of gross human rights violation to come forward and tell their stories at the TRC. By speaking out, seeking the truth, victims can find closure. Government wanted to ensure that such human rights abuses do not happen again, to invoke empathy by sharing their stories. Last one, 2.2.3, it's a definition. Explain the term reconciliation in the context of the TRC. Let's go to the answer immediately. The state of affairs in which victims and perpetrators of human rights abuses would live in peace and harmony, friendly relations, restoration of broken relations between victims and perpetrators, the process through which victims of human rights abuse would have to forgive perpetrators who would have undertaken full disclosure of human rights abuses they committed, basically. Now let's go to the paragraph quickly. 2.6, using the information relevant source in your own knowledge, write a paragraph about 8 lines explaining how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission dealt with the murder of political activist Griffith Mzingi. Now, here's a clear example of how you should write your paragraph. Now, take note, learners. If this is in bullet form, you will not be receiving full marks, even if you've got all the answers in it. Now, let's look at the answer that was provided here. The key here is explain how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission dealt with the murder. Now, take note, we said you underline what needs to be underlined. And we can clearly see, let me read quickly through it. The TRC was established to investigate human rights abuses that were committed during apartheid. Look how we indicated the reference source 2A. And as you can read through the source, you can see 2B is identified, 2C is identified, 2D is identified. And when we go to the last sentence, the TRC acted in accordance with the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act 1995, own knowledge. So now we can clearly see that own knowledge is also important that we provide it. Now, learners, we dealt with the TRC. I'm sure you should have a clear understanding what is the content pertaining to the TRC. So, learners, thank you for watching this lesson. See you next time. Bye.